This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am still trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Forgive me, listener, for it has been 2 years since my last podcast. All I can say is I'm sorry. I had every intention of coming back to this sooner, and it seems like one thing after the other slowed me down. To sum it all up, work has been crazy and continues to be crazy, so no promises about whatever cadence I might be able to continue. But I've got the itch again to talk to you all. Maybe there's one or two of you out there still who cares about listening. You'll notice the new music. One of the things I have obsessed over the last 2 years is trying to find that gospel influence but secular sound, and I think I got this in a track called Find a Way by Captain Joss on the Artlist royalty-free music site. So I'm actually really happy with it. It's probably a little intense. I hope it's not triggering, but that is kind of the sound that I've been looking for quite some time. I understand that I have missed a lot. I understand that the Deconversion Anonymous Facebook group is continuing and thriving. I hear that a book has been written by one of the members of the Deconversion Anonymous Facebook group. That book is called Apostate, Stories of Deconversion by Sarah Bacall. And I understand that many of you contributed your stories to that book. You may be able to tell from the difference in the audio when I've edited that I've actually recorded and re-recorded this episode a few times. Through a couple of the iterations, I went back and listened and realized that I was angry. And maybe you can relate. The world is crazy, the state of politics, the economy, how people are suffering, watching people shot in the streets. It would be insane not to be angry. But I realized that there are 100 podcasts out there who can be angry with you. And what I'm trying to do with this podcast is be graceful. And it turns out being graceful is very, very difficult. So I am definitely not a person without anger. The couple of iterations of this episode prove that. But I'm going to try to flip the script and keep myself in the aspirational mode of trying to be the graceful atheist. So why am I back? I recently listened to the Rhett and Link podcast, Ear Biscuits, where they did an anniversary episode of their deconstruction stories. And that really inspired me. My 10-year anniversary was in August. And so I've been quite reflective about my whole deconversion process. And so I went back and listened to the first interview I ever gave to Steve Hilliker on Voices of Deconversion. It was fascinating for me because of two things. One, you can hear I'm just boiling over with passion to talk about deconversion, and I had no one else to talk to about it at the time. It was the first time I was able to tell my story. And two, I'm amazed at how much of the secular grace message is still the same. My feeling about and the way I communicate about secular grace is the same. So that nascent idea very, very early on is the thing that has driven this podcast from the get-go and continues to do so. So I wanted to do a couple of things. I wanted to tell my deconversion story again, reflect on what has stayed the same and what has changed. Ironically, in order to tell my deconversion story, I have to tell you a little bit about my faith story. Unlike many of you, I grew up in a really nominally Christian household. We did not go to church. Everybody in my family drank. Everybody in my family smoked. But there was some semblance of belief in God. And I've joked many times that as a 12 or 13-year-old, I would ask my parents, my grandparents, who is this God character anyway? Quoting Douglas Adams. Really, the representations of Christianity that I saw were very severe. I had a great grandmother who was a very strict Methodist woman, and all I knew from her was I was a sinner and I was going to hell. But there was no gospel there, nothing attractive about that. I went to youth group a few times, once or twice, and mostly felt judged. it was made known that I didn't fit in. The part of the story that I have to tell you for this to all to make sense is to know that my mom was a drug and alcohol addict, and that her conversion experience was quite dramatic. So after years and years of drinking, she came to me one day and said, Jesus told me to stop drinking. Sure. Yeah, whatever. I had heard that so many times. There'd been so many promises broken. And here's the thing. She was clean and sober that day. She was clean and sober the next day. And for a solid 10 years, she was clean and sober. The rest of her story is tragic, and she ultimately died of her disease. But during that 10-year window, I got my mom back. I got the person who I knew was underneath the addiction. So while mom was getting healthy and going to 12-step programs, a major part of my story is that because I had so limited exposure to church, and the little exposure that I did have was negative, 12 steps became the first spirituality that I had ever had contact with. And this is the thing that I saw there. There was rigorous honesty. There was humility. There were people telling stories about things that they had done that had hurt people deeply. But there was also a group of people there who were saying, we forgive you, we accept you, we've been there, we've done that. And I took away from that a deep need for rigorous honesty. And what I mean by rigorous honesty here in this context is you can lie to other people, don't lie to yourself. And I've said before that some of the seeds of deconversion are in Christianity. Like Christianity believes in humility, believes in honesty. And I think those are some things that ultimately lead a person out. She did not press her faith on me in any way. She did buy me a Bible at one point in time. And the thing I did different from most people I know is I read it. I read the whole thing. I read the Old Testament. I read the New Testament long before I ever stepped foot in church. By the time I got to church, I definitely considered myself a Christian, and I had a deep inner faith. I believed in Jesus Christ as my Savior. I believed that He atoned for my sins, that I was a sinner, that I needed forgiveness. And it was actually quite beneficial for me. It gave me a lot of confidence. I had fallen apart when my mom got healthier. Ultimately, I dropped out of high school and had very little direction in where I wanted to go. So by the time I got to church, I was about 18 or 19. And of course, I didn't fit in the youth group. It was a small enough church. There weren't college age groups, that kind of thing. So they had no idea what to do with me. And basically he said I could volunteer with the youth group. I had a pretty amazing youth pastor who I appreciate his kindness to me even today. And he took me under his wing and really supported me through learning what it was to be a Christian. I wouldn't say that I had real doubts yet, but what I would say is that I was surprised by the difference of what I read in the gospel, the grace that I saw in the gospel, and what I saw in the church. What I saw in the church was a lot more judgmental, a lot more shame, a lot more, you have to follow the rules. At the time, I happened to have long hair, and that was frowned upon in the denomination that I was in. And I thought, well, where'd you get that, right? That's not in the Bible. So I very much saw my mission as teaching the church, or rather, I saw my mission as reminding the church about grace. So rather than running away screaming, I dove in and helped out with the youth group and taught the Bible and just completely absorbed my life into the church. That same youth pastor was one of the first people in my life to say, you're good at this, you could do something with this, and encouraged me to go to Bible college. Until this point, I hadn't even considered college. I was lucky enough to have grandparents who helped me. I paid for about half, they paid for about half, and I was able to go to a small private college in Northern California. It was a very conservative, theologically and politically, Bible college. I've said many times, it was the best of times. It was the worst of times. The worst parts were being infantilized and treated as a child, right as I was becoming an adult. But I had amazing professors. I know that some of you who have gone to Bible college or religious colleges did not have this experience, but I had really amazing professors who were interested in finding the truth. And I often say that Jesus won my heart when I first read the gospel, and theology won my mind when I went to Bible college. So I was all in. I tell all this part of the story to just say I was 100% in. I was doing church on the street. I was evangelizing people on the street. I believed with all of my heart that Christianity was true. I'm not saying that I didn't have any doubts. I definitely questioned things. And I think with hindsight, with a tremendous amount of hindsight, I can see where I knew if I dove into one particular subject too deeply, I might not like what I found. For example, my professors were honest about the way that the Bible came together, that it was effectively editing by committee. They were pretty honest and straightforward about that, but also providing the apologetics in order to be comforted and not worry about that. And I just didn't dig that deep. I took it at face value. After college was when I had the roughest time. While in college, the professors were open and interested in finding the truth and challenged us to think. The second I got out and I had to sign on the dotted line that I believed the tenets of faith of my particular denomination, the vibe changed dramatically. And I knew that I had to conform in order to do the thing I had worked so hard to become a pastor. I went into youth ministry myself. Work at the church was, wonderful with the people, with the youth group, I wound up doing a college age group, which actually the part that I enjoyed the most because I could delve into theology and deeper subjects. But the pressure of being a pastor, as many of you have told me, either being pastors yourselves or pastors' kids, is ridiculous. And I was suffering under that. I did wind up having a relationship with an adult mom in the youth group that obviously did not go over well. And that ended ministry for me. You would think that that is when I started deconstructing and deconverting, but actually I doubled down. I really believed that grace was the thing and that grace was missing in the church. I knew how much I needed grace. I knew that I was a sinner and I needed grace. Fortunately, I got married to my now wife, who was my college sweetheart from Bible college. We reunited after 5 or 6 years. We had 2 kids who are amazing, and I've had just this wonderful life. This is that phase where things are working, where you don't have a tremendous amount of cognitive dissonance. Yes, there are areas where you might say to yourself, I can't really dig too deeply there. I don't know what I'll find if I keep going. So we're definitely things like that. But for the most part, I was satisfied with my faith. And 20 years go by, so a very long time. So this is a non-trivial amount of time. I did have challenges to my faith during that 20-year period of time. I had a good friend who gave me Sam Harris's The End of Faith. It didn't really make a dent. I felt like atheists in particular, but the world in general just didn't get Jesus. They didn't get grace the way that I did. So internally, I thought I understood something that no one else did. It was actually not Sam Harris's book that started to lead to questions. It was more my recognition that I was an island, that I was terminally unique in the 12-step lingo. I began to realize that other believers who were much more legalistic, from my perspective, or interpreted the Bible differently than me, were just as convinced as I was how I was right, and they are just as convinced that they are right, and they are correcting the church or correcting the world. So that was the beginning of some seeds of doubt. Then at some point in time, I read apologists. I read all the rage at the time was intelligent design. So I read a book that I've mentioned in the past. The title escapes me right at the moment, Against Evolution and for Intelligent Design. And this troubled me more than anything because I believed the conclusions about faith. I believed that, the existence of God and God as creator by faith. But I recognized in the apologetics the poor arguments, the flaws in the argumentation. So again, even though I accepted the underlying idea, God as creator, I could not accept the arguments, and I didn't, even at the time, agree with doing away with evolution. I knew evolution had so much scientific backing that it was inescapable. So this started to bother me as well. If the arguments for faith that I had run into, I disagreed with, even when I agreed with the conclusions, what did that say about my reasons for faith? And I very slowly started to allow myself to say things like, if my faith is worth anything, it should stand up to scrutiny. In hindsight, I think this is the beginning of deconstruction for me. And sidebar, I think that there are multiple things that we deconstruct. We deconstruct God, we deconstruct the Bible, and we deconstruct church. For me, it was mostly about the Bible that was deconstructing for me around this time. I think I had already deconstructed church a bit already, but God was the part that was going to hang on to the bitter end. I talk about precipitating events, and this can be trivial things like reading a book from an apologist, or it can be serious things like the loss of a loved one or the loss of a job or something tragic in your life. But you stop and wonder, can this be true? Is it completely true? And it is the beginnings of doubt. And I would say that I wasn't cognizant of that yet, but that was what was happening. Another major touch point for my deconversion was getting in contact with a number of family members on Facebook who happened to be Mormon. I knew nothing about Mormonism, and out of just pure curiosity, I started to look into it. What is it that they believe? Because as an evangelical, I had heard how they were terribly wrong, and so I was curious about what was different. I want to be clear here. I did not do a super deep dive here. I'm not an expert in any way, but it was clear that the claims that were within Mormonism that I thought were unsubstantiated were no different than the claims that evangelical Christianity was making. So I had that moment of realization that, wow, what reasons do I have for believing what I believe if I can see the holes in this group of people's beliefs? What am I not telling myself about my own beliefs? About a year or so before I deconverted, I wanted to read through the Bible again. So I got one of those plans that tells you what to read every day and began to do that. Read through it again. The thing is that for whatever reason, and this wasn't something I was trying to do, the rose-colored glasses were off. So whereas when I had read the Bible in the past, it was exciting, it was new, it was revealing God to me, as I thought. But this time I was really letting the text speak to me. In Bible college, they taught us to say that the text cannot mean something that it didn't mean to the original author and the original hearers or readers. And that's called exegesis. You're trying to find out, what did it mean then? And so I was letting it kind of just wash over me, particularly the Old Testament, but not exclusively the Old Testament. The anger and the wrath and the destruction of one's enemies that was relatively constant throughout the reading. My wife started to notice, and she would say, you're angry. What are you angry at? And I had no idea what it was. And it was that I was seeing it for what it actually says for the first time. And I can appreciate it for its own beauty. And I don't want to diminish the cultural aspects and the humans working out how to live in the ancient Near East. I get it. I am not one of those people who says, well, this is all stupid. It was a depiction of a group of people at a moment in time in a particular culture, in a particular context, with particular theological views, and didn't have much to say to me in the 21st century. And I was recognizing that for the first time in this particular read through. Within that same year, around that time, my wife and I and friends were doing a book read through of Philip Yancey's prayer. Philip Yancey had such a profound impact on my Christianity. The Jesus I Never Knew was revolutionary for me when I was in my mid-20s. It was one of the most important books in my Christian walk. So I deeply respected Philip Yancey. I still do. I think he's a great writer. Note from future editing, David, there's been relatively recent news that Philip Yancey had an ongoing affair for several years, and he has stopped his ministry and completely stopped being in the public eye. So I'll just say here, hey, Philip, I've got a lot of grace for you. If you'd like to come on the podcast and talk to me about it, please do. Reach out. But as we were going through his book on prayer, I could feel the struggle in the language that he was using, trying to say that prayer was meaningful in some way, but also acknowledging that it really doesn't do anything. Like reading between the lines, you could hear Yancey's struggle coming through the pages. This was definitely having the opposite effect on me as I think Philip Yancey would like. It was making me realize how ineffectual prayer was. I had already been telling my wife I didn't want to pray out loud for people. Like I was already uncomfortable with it. And I think it was this creeping understanding that it wasn't actually doing anything. And in hindsight, maybe I was just talking to myself. But I still wasn't done. I was still all in. That's the thing that's difficult to express, is even as these doubts came, these precipitating events, it was not the end. In fact, some short months before my deconversion, I was having a conversation with my father-in-law and my nephew, and I had deconstructed, would not have used the word at the time, but had deconstructed to the point where basically the only thing I could hold on to anymore was that my sensus divinitas, the sense that God existed, and my faith in the resurrection. And that was it. I was trying to convey to them that even if you threw away everything else, that just that was enough for faith. And I was really trying to convince myself in that conversation. I talk about critical mass, which is a number of precipitating events happening at the same time. This is sometimes called the dark night of the soul, where one has serious doubts, but generally is expected to come out of it on the other side with stronger faith. The next step beyond that is something I call permission to doubt. And I think I had been in that phase, not cognizantly, not consciously, but I'd been in that phase for a while. And so I had started to, not intentionally, but read atheist thinkers. My gateway drug of all things was Roger Ebert on Twitter at the time. So I was a huge movie buff. I loved Roger Ebert as a movie critic, followed him on Twitter, and he would occasionally refer to his atheism and why he was not a Christian. And so I would read it. And again, I thought, well, it's too bad that he doesn't understand grace and Jesus the way I do. But I was starting to just have these outside influences. The point I want to make for any believers who might be listening is it wasn't the outside influences that changed me. It was the inside questions that led me to listen to the outside influences. In other words, it's pretty easy to blame the world, the influence of media, the influence of non-believers. But really, this was internally driven. And I want to make that point really clear. I had given myself permission to question. I had eventually started to read on Twitter again. I'm a liberal, so I got a lot of articles from Salon, the online magazine. And many atheist writers wrote for Salon. And one of them was an atheist writer named Greta Christina. Greta had written a number of really interesting articles, one of which was called "Why Are Atheists So Angry?" And when I read that, I realized that I agreed with most of the points that she was making. But the one that really got to me was an article about the lack of a soul. It was really making the argument that our bodies are who we are, that there is no substance outside of our bodies that make us the people that we are. And it was the simple idea of people who have been in physical accidents where their personalities have dramatically changed. That was just so obvious that this was correct. A person can take a substance, a chemical, a drug, and have a different experience, so that the physical world affects our personalities and who we are. And it just came crashing home that the concept of a soul was not true. This is where things get a little bit fuzzy for me. It might have been in that particular instance, but at some point I applied this same thought process to Jesus and the resurrection. And it became clear to me that I no longer believed in the resurrection. And like Paul says in 1 Corinthians, if Christ is not raised, then we are of all men most to be pitied. And I knew if I didn't believe in the resurrection, that was it. It was game over. Here's what's maybe slightly different about my story compared to the average, let's say. I was done. I knew immediately that I no longer believed in the supernatural at all. If I didn't even believe in my own soul, and I didn't believe in a resurrection, there was no need to believe in the supernatural or things like ghosts or any of the other religious claims. All I need it to be is true. I sometimes use the analogy of the old time movies where somebody would fall off a building and they would hit awning after awning after awning on the way down and then land on the ground. That's what it felt like to me. And I think this was really about rigorous honesty. I couldn't pretend. I couldn't lie to myself. I couldn't make myself believe. And so I just needed to be honest and with myself that I was done. And I knew instantaneously I was an atheist. It's fair to say that because I had read Greta Christina and had read, a handful of articles from other atheists, that I had the mental framework, the verbiage to understand what had happened to me. And I was just okay with saying that I was an atheist. And then the next thought was, how in the world am I going to tell my wife? I've told this part of the story a few times, but between the oh shit moment and telling my wife about 3 months later, I did what I typically do, all on my own. I read a pile of books. I read a lot more blog posts. I was particularly trying to find humanist messages, not just the angry atheists at the time, but also something with meaning and purpose. So not just the negative, I don't believe in Christianity, but what was the positive? What values do I hold? What do I think is the most important in life? And the other thing that I recognized was that I was still really the same person. My morality had not changed. I had a lot less guilt, but I had not suddenly become a different person. I still cared about people. I had no new desire to run rampant without a deity overlooking my shoulder. It was an incredible sense of freedom, of the burden of Christianity. And this is the irony. Paul talks about the scales falling from one's eyes. This is literally the sensation of that experience of deconverting. In past episodes with many of our friends of the podcast, we've talked about various movies and media that describe the experience. We've talked about The Matrix. We've talked about The Truman Show. We've talked about Oblivion. There are a number of movies where the characters do not have the full view of reality, and that reality begins to impose itself on them as the story goes on. And then suddenly they suddenly they recognize the truth, the reality. And that is very much what the experience was like. After reading a number of books and other blog posts, it's not so much that I learned anything particularly new, but it was finding out that others had gone there before me. This was not particularly unusual. That was comforting. But I knew that I had to tell my wife. I have friends in the deconversion community who took very long times to tell their spouses. I'm not saying that you have to do this, but for me, I could not live with this extreme change that had just taken place and not tell Michelle. So about 3 months after my oh shit moment, we were on vacation. My palms were sweating. I was terrified. We were chatting and I really underplayed where I was at and said, I have to tell you that I'm having some doubts. And of course, things get very tense and very quiet. And I elaborated a little bit, but I did not immediately explain that I had completely lost all faith, that I was truly an atheist at that point. The main message that I was trying to get across to her in that moment, and really honestly every day since then, is that my love for her did not change. Just like my morality didn't change, my relationship with her was still the most important thing in my life. My relationship with my 2 girls was the most important thing in my life. And that I personally had no intentions of letting that go or walking away from those relationships if she was willing to stay with me. And here's the thing. I wouldn't have blamed her if she did leave. The relationship was ostensibly predicated upon our faith. We both went to Bible college together. During our wedding, our vows had all kinds of things to do with our faith in Jesus. And so I knew I was putting a knife into her heart and twisting. And that was maybe the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. Now, this was not quick. This was not painless. I think we had an anniversary about a month later, and that was mostly tears as I was letting her in on the reality of that I was truly an atheist, that I was truly a humanist and no longer a Christian. Brian Peck talked about this way back when. He was saying that the significant other, the loved one, is at step 0. But we have gone through all of the process at this point. I had gone through all of the process at this point of a full-blown deconversion. I had gone through the doubling down. I had gone through the arguing with God. I had gone through the deconstruction. I had gone through letting go of bits and pieces. I had gone through all of that. I've let go of my faith. I had done a ton of research and I was feeling all this freedom and joy. So what I'm trying to get at is I couldn't just come at Michelle and expect her to change her faith in any way. And I didn't. And in that sense, I needed to be the more graceful of the two of us to help her through the process. But because Michelle is so amazing, it took her some time, but she began to see this as, in Esther Perel's words, a second marriage to the same person. She took on that ownership and decided she wanted to stay with me. And I am incredibly thankful for that. Circling back to the immediate months after the deconversion, I desperately wanted to talk about this with somebody, and I couldn't talk about it with family because they are all believers. And as I've said on the podcast many times, it was not something I could talk about with my non-believing friends either, most of whom were atheists by default. They'd never really been religious. It wasn't an important thing one way or the other to them. So I couldn't come in with all this emotion and grief and anger and have them understand. So I began to search around for other people like me, and it turned out there were a lot. At the time, this was before Twitter was a hellscape. I was on Twitter and was able to connect with a number of people. And I knew I wanted to share my story. I connected with 2 or 3 people in the early days. We wound up doing a very short-lived YouTube show called Secular Hangouts. Really a lot of what is today the Graceful Atheist, I was working out at that time. In 2017, I did an interview with Steve Hilliker on the Voices of Deconversion podcast. In preparation for this episode, I just re-listened to that. And man, a lot of what is the Graceful Atheist podcast was expressed in that interview. The secular grace, the no change in morality, the embracing one's humanity, embracing others' humanity. All of it was there. And that was super cathartic. It was such a cathartic experience to tell the whole story from beginning to end. And that was the first actual opportunity that I had to really tell the whole story. If you go back and listen to it yourself, what you hear is me saying, I want to do something with this. I want to build community somehow. And it wasn't too long after that. I think it took 2 years, 2019 or so is when I started the podcast, but I had started a blog prior to that. On the blog, there's some of my deconversion story. There's some discussion about deconversion in general. My first writings about secular grace are there. But I eventually realized I wanted to do a podcast myself. One other big influence at the time was Ryan Bell and his podcast, Life After God. So with just a handful of connections on Twitter, I jumped in and wanted to do the podcast. Again, in preparation for this episode, I went and listened to the first episode that talks about what I was trying to accomplish. And many of the things that I said there were definitely true and some were not. One was about secular grace, which has obviously been a major portion of the story of the podcast from beginning to end. Deconversion stories has definitely been a part of the podcast from the beginning, including anonymous ones for people to be able to tell their stories without having to reveal their personal identities. The last one was about talking with believers. That one has been more challenging. I had this concept called an honesty contest. I had found so much joy and freedom and release by being honest with myself and being vulnerable that I thought that having deeply honest conversations with people with whom I disagreed would be amazing. And that is amazing if both sides are being as equally honest. With a few notable exceptions, Michelle being one of them, most of the time that wasn't the case. And so, although I'm very open to continuing to have honesty contests, conversations with believers or people with whom I disagree, I'm going to be very, very selective about who I choose to have those conversations with. But the personal stories of other people's deconversion stories were really powerful. And that, I think, is the thing that drove the podcast. And it grew. And I had people volunteer like Mike T and Arlene and many, many, many others. The Deconversion Anonymous Facebook group got started and is still running today, even though I've been off the air for 2 years. So it has been amazing how the podcast progressed and the community was built. Now, you might be thinking, well, David, we haven't heard from you for 2 years. That is true. Definitely work gets in the way. And after 5 years of the podcast, I had to put it on hiatus. I think I needed that time away. But I'm beginning to have that gut pull again to do some things. I want to be clear that probably not going back to a weekly podcast anytime soon, but once in a while, I'm going to throw something out there. And as over the years, we'll see what we can do with the podcast for it to continue. Now, the inspiration for this episode was to retell my deconversion story. But the other thing I wanted to talk about was what has changed and what hasn't changed. And I will start with what hasn't changed. Again, listening to my interview with Steve Hilliker, so much of the messaging, what I want to get across to the world, is in that interview, which is now 8 years old. And so the whole idea of secular grace was there at the beginning. The other thing that has not changed is I am definitely an atheist. I am a secular humanist. I'm a naturalist. I do not believe in the supernatural in any way. I've not been tempted to join a different religion. I am still very nervous about joining groups in general. So that has definitely not changed. And here's the thing I will also say. This could be perceived as negative, but this is my experience. I've also, over the 10 years, listened to hundreds and hundreds of debates. Of late, I've been in church services quite a bit. I'm literally kind of doing a Bible study. But never once have I thought, wow, that's a piece of information or a piece of evidence that I had never considered. That has not happened to me once in the 10 years that I have been a deconvert. What I'm trying to get across to you here is that one of the definitions of deconversion is the slow rising of the standard of evidence for you personally. And when I was in my faith, that standard was faith and what other people told me. And as I began to deconstruct, I needed more and more evidence. On the other side of deconversion, it would take real empirical data to show me anything supernatural beyond a personal theistic God. We have no evidence whatsoever of anything supernatural. So that has not changed. The negative way to see that is that my heart has been hardened and I am not open to spirituality. The flip side of that is that I think this is the human experience, and that embracing our humanity, embracing others' humanity, is where we experience real joy, real connection, real belonging, real awe. The original point of this podcast, the whole idea of the kind of humanism, the secular grace humanism that I've been describing, is that you can still be a complete human who is fulfilled, happy, joyful, awe-filled, connected, and belonging. And that is the point. But that is still the message of this podcast, is that you can be a good person. You can be a kind person. You can be a person who builds community, who connects with human beings, who accepts everyone, who makes the world a better place on a daily basis, and yet does not believe in the supernatural at all. So what's new since my deconversion 10 years ago? This is one of the things that I've recorded a couple of different times because it's a hard thing to answer. It's much clearer to me what is the same. And that sounds like I haven't grown or haven't changed or haven't been willing to learn. And I don't think that that's true either. So here's an attempt at a few things that are new. I'm going to give you just a little bit of insight at the high level of Michelle and my relationship. And what I want to be clear about is that I have chosen to take a step towards Michelle and engage with her on things that are important to her. And as a believer, the most important thing to her is her faith. And so I need my deconversion listeners to understand that I do this by choice, not because I'm being manipulated to do so. And for my believing listeners to understand that the reason I do this is because I love Michelle. That is the reason. One of the things that we have done is started to listen to Tim Mackey from the Bible Project. We've gone through some of his work on Genesis. We're doing the Sermon on the Mount as we speak. And because Tim Mackey is as smart as he is, I've gained some appreciation for the Bible as literature and how no wonder these stories lasted through the centuries. They are so well crafted, and listening to someone like Tim Mackey dig into the literary aspects is just very impressive. This has brought Michelle and I closer together. And I realized that, it takes two to tango, and it was partially me holding back from her and vice versa. And so me taking a step towards her has really enhanced that relationship. I feel closer to her. I hope that she feels the same way. And it's been a really net positive. The other thing that might surprise people is that I have attended church with her quite often. Now, I don't necessarily recommend this for all the listeners, for those of you in deconstruction and deconversion. But again, this is something that I've done by choice. And here's the surprise. The surprise is that my experience there is, not 100% positive. That's not surprising. What is surprising is that I have approached it almost like an anthropologist. And to give the believers a sense of this, if a Christian believer were to attend, let's say, a mosque or a Hindu ceremony, there would be a certain element of detachment. It might be beautiful. It might be moving even, but it would feel distant in some way or another. And there would be a sense of objectivity in how you observe and take in. This has been my experience as an atheist in church, is the anthropologist instincts kicked in. Interesting. This song is really saying something about what this group of people wants, what they want to believe, what they want to be true about the world. And I've just gained a tremendous amount of empathy for believers. So that's something new. And I think as a amateur anthropologist, what I'm coming to understand is that this is all of us just trying to work it out. Looking through the Bible, you realize that it was a particular group of people in a particular time in a particular culture just trying to work it out. And we in the 21st century are just trying to work it out. The other surprise was realizing again the connection to grace, that when I'm reading the Sermon on the Mount and there are graceful things there, like I can take that in and say, oh yeah, that's where secular grace came from for me. But I simultaneously can remain, detached is the wrong word, but have my critical facilities intact and say, I'm taking this and I'm leaving that. It no longer applies to me. And in fact, in the negative, there have been times attending church where there's a heavy, almost guilt trip to the Christians about the Christians not being good Christians enough. And I realize that doesn't apply to me. I could just let it fly right over. The surprise for me has been, I've been more connected to believers and realized that I can still learn something from that. I can still learn about how to be a good human being. Even back when I was a Christian and I was teaching, I would say that Jesus teaches us how to be human. So I think that is partially still true, right? I think Jesus was a man who was trying to work it out and had some good ideas and some bad ideas. And we can look at that now with a critical eye, take what we like and leave the rest. I think also new is a deeper understanding of how difficult it is to create community. I have a blog post where I talk about how the secular community has not understood the need for that deep community connection and winds up making people go through the deconversion process by themselves. Obviously, that's what we've been trying to do here with the podcast and the Facebook group, is bring people together so that you are not alone when you go through the deconversion process. But again, I've learned, I think in that 10 years, how difficult that actually is in real life. To draw people together continuously. That's why the world religions have as many proponents as they do, in that they provide that natural mechanism to get together. Our friends over at Beyond Atheism talked about the lack of third spaces in the United States. And I've just really come to viscerally understand that. How can we build these third spaces that would bring people together and provide community in a secular format? That continues to be my obsession, but I think I've just learned in a deeper way how true that is, that we're lacking it. Now more than ever, potentially, in the world of social media and our addiction to our own phones, how do we break out of the social isolation or the pseudo community of social media to actually meet one another in real life? Again, just deeper appreciation for how difficult a problem that is and how desperately we need that. So another thing, I'm not sure I would say that it is new, but I would say that I'm working on it. I'm working towards it, is having more empathy for people wherever they land on the spectrum of, for lack of a better term, spirituality. For those people who are spiritual but not religious, but they're still holding on to something that I don't personally think they need, a sense of the transcendent in some way or another. I think we get all of that from our relationships with each other and our experience of nature and the ABCs of secular spirituality, the awe, belonging, and connection. But I've become more empathetic of people wherever they land. I'm learning to have more grace for people just working it out. I'm going to keep saying that over and over again. People are just working it out. Maybe in the spot for the secular grace thought of the week, but also continuing on with things that are new, is a recognition that I am not graceful. A recognition that I am very judgmental. And the angrier that I am, or the more burnt out with the way the world is going, the more frustrated that I am, the less graceful I am. My nature is judgmental. For those of you who were a part of a spiritual gifts style Christian background, I was always the guy with discernment, which is another way of saying being critical. So criticality is in my nature. I think it's what led me out of Christianity. It is what makes me good at my technical job. And so I'm recognizing that I need to contain that where it's appropriate, use it. When it is about people, when it's about human beings, I need to hold it back. I need to recognize people's humanity and love them. Loving people, having grace for people is hard. Even the segment that preceded this, having empathy for people who land on the spiritual but not religious spectrum, I have to say, is difficult for me. I know I want to have grace. I need to have grace, but I have to work at that. That is not my first reaction. Often in the debate world, people will say that atheists have just replaced religion with anti-religion, and that atheists are just as angry and just as fundamentalist as the religious. And that is a very overly simplistic way of referring to this. First of all, I'm talking about just myself and not anyone else. I find that the grace that I want to show is difficult. And like in a 12-step program, being too tired, too hungry, too angry, I don't live up to my own principles, to my own ideals. So one of the reasons I was getting the itch to come back to this and podcast and talk to you is as much to remind myself of the person who I want to be. I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Okay, so I've now thrown this podcast out after a 2-year hiatus. What happens next? My day job continues to be all-consuming. My family continues to be my first priority. Again, I do not want to get people's hopes up. I am going to try to release episodes as often as I can, which will be sporadic and probably months in between. I have a handful of ideas that I'd like to continue with. I want to be clear that part of the burnout from the first 5 years was trying to continually ratchet up. If you listen to the last episode, it's like everything ratcheted up. It had to be better and better and better. And I felt like I had to grow the audience and I had to reach more people. And I'm actually going to ratchet down. That's probably going to be lower tech. I think it's going to be focused on things that I deeply care about. And if you're there for the ride, if you want to come along, that's fantastic. If this is not your cup of tea, more power to you. I have no problem with that whatsoever. I might get into areas of things like AI and how that affects us as human beings. If there's interest in that, write me, gracefulatheist@gmail.com. I might, expand beyond just deconversion stories to talk about other subjects. That is yet to be determined. For those of you who have continued to give on Patreon over the years, wow, you are incredible people. I can't. There's definitely a part of me that wants to say, please stop doing that, because I cannot promise how many episodes I'm going to do in any given year. I do keep it on because the back catalog, every new person comes to it, and many of them listen to the entire catalog. And so I do allow them to, if they feel like it, to give. But if you've given for more than a few months, you can stop. It's okay. No guilt whatsoever. And, someday, if I'm able to restart the podcast at full tilt, then you can come back. So again, you have my permission, in fact, my blessing, to stop giving. For all of the volunteers that have helped with Deconversion Anonymous and the Facebook group, thank you, thank you, thank you. I hope that you continue to do that work. I see the Deconversion Anonymous group as independent of this podcast. I hope that we continue to have goodwill for each other, but I hope that continues on its own. With that, I think I'm going to wrap and say thank you so much for listening. Thank you, the audience, for being here along this ride with me, and help me celebrate 10 years of Deconversion. Thank you so much. Until next time, my name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. If you want to get in touch with me to be a guest on the show, email me at gracefulatheist@gmail.com. For blog posts, quotes, recommendations, and full episode transcripts, head over to gracefulatheist.com. This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast.